two microphones, but I probably need to sit maybe closer to one of them if there is a problem. Look, thank you very much. For those that don't know, the results from the election have been confirmed. Nationals lost 2 seats, so that's an interesting bit of news coming through from my son. Not lost 2 seats; I've got less seats on election night. But can we just move on back to you, Margot? And thank you very much for the copies of your bundle of information.
You're welcome.
And I now have a copy of. We now have a copy of John Paul's evidence in front of us. So
great.
Over to you, and I presume he's online.
Thank you. There he is.
I am here, yes. Right here, indeed.
Hello, John Paul.
I apologize for yesterday. It was rainy here in Chile, and I don't know what happened with that service at my hotel. But what can I say?
Okay, very good. Well, at least we've got you now. So, Margot,
good now.
Do you want to
good
introduce us?
John Paul, have you got the PowerPoint presentation in front of you?
Yes, I do have it. The one is
here.
So
and you can just speak to those points as works well for you.
Yes, that's fine with me.
Thank you.
So I would start by saying that I've been asked to talk about the adverse effects of avoiding adverse effects of airport noise. The debate, which I'm sure you've been wrestling with, about 50 dBA versus 55 dBA, and some of the modeling assumptions, which when I looked at there, some issues that I have with those modeling assumptions that went into creating the contours. So next slide, please.
Can someone go next slide? My one's not working. Oh, there it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you look through the literature, and I had the benefit of having arguably the world's expert on remaining alive, because there was another guy who was probably equally was as highly regarded, who died a couple of years ago. Most countries use 55 to 57 dB for the onset of adverse effects. There's lots of variability in what the noise actually is, because acoustics, a decibel, 3 decibels is twice the energy, but you need about 10 decibels for it to actually sound twice as loud. So there's a lot of give and play in the decibel metrics, and the 10% annoyance is usually in the 55 to 60 dB area. However, that could vary in some studies, just because of the tolerance of folks, the weather on the day, etc., over the course of the year, and the kind of activities up to 25. So there's some room to play, but overall across the world, 55 dB has been the sort of low end of what people think of being as highly annoyed. And so we typically use that as sort of the limit on what you'd think about keeping things to the point where they're annoyance. I will add that in the US, they use 65 DNL, A-weighted, but that was based on also economic considerations back in the 70s when they set those numbers. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Can I just ask you there, Professor Clark, we've had a question from somebody who's at the hearing. Is there something that you can give as an example of, like, what does 55 sound like? Is that a normal conversation, or is it a lawnmower, or what does that relate to? Okay,
so this thing about acoustics is we are somewhat schizophrenic in the term use of the word dBA. So an instantaneous sound, like I'm speaking now, in a casual conversation would be 60 dBA, and like your one-on-one conversation with somebody next to you. But that is actually a peak noise level.
Yeah.
But then if you want to look over the course of an entire event, you basically say, okay, I want to see how much energy is contained in the mountain, which is typically what a noise signature looks like when an airplane comes over you, within 10 dB of that peak. And that's what you call basically a sound exposure level. It's an integrated level. This LDN is what's basically averaged over the course of an entire year. You can do an LDN EQ of 16 hours for the day to see what would be averaged energy over the course of a day, or you can do it over the course of a year with weightings for the night, adding 10 dB at night because night is more sensitive. So while it says dBA, there are multiple levels of dBA. And so it's hard to compare what this 55 is to what a peak dBA level would be in a conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. Is that the next slide?
Yeah, it's the next slide. Yeah.
This is the next slide. There we go.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the things that, you know, as I hinted at in my first, speaking to the first slide, or the second slide rather, you know, 55 is pretty much what everybody around the world does and uses as their level. To be honest, I don't know when 50 got sort of been mulled around as being an outer band, but it's certainly not what is standard. And if it, you know, if I was in any jurisdiction, 55 would be the, except here, 55 would be the standard that we would use.
Thank you. Could you speak to the Taylor-Baines report?
Oh, well, that report, it wasn't an apples to apples comparison, in my view, to what the previous report was, previous studies, because they actually didn't do in 5 dB increments like the previous ones. So the previous ones had 45 to 50, 50 to 55, and then 55 to 60, 60 to 65. And the Taylor-Baines, if my memory serves me correct, did 45 to 50, 50 to 55, and then lumped 55 to 65 together. Was it 50 to 65 or something like that? So it wasn't really an apples and oranges. And if you look at all the different studies that have been done across the world, what you see is that the noise level has not really, and people's tolerance for noise has not gotten any worse or any better. It's about the same across, you know, the last 30, 40, 50 years.
Margot, can I ask about the Taylor-Baines report? Taylor-Baines are social impact assessment experts. That's my understanding. Do you know their speciality? Taylor-Baines?
Yes, that's correct, Commissioner. They're not acoustic experts. They are social impact people. So they had a survey about the impact of airport noise in particular, and the likelihood of complaints. And they interestingly broke it down into just complaining to the other people that you live with, or actually making a formal complaint to the airport or the city council or whomever.
And the work that you're talking about, John Paul, that was a 2002 report. That's what we're referring to.
As the Taylor-Baines study, which is relied on by Marshall Day as showing that in some way Christchurch people are more sensitive to noise than everybody else on the planet, and that's why it should be 50 here rather than 55. But what they did was break down households into those people, as Professor Clark has just said, those people who live between 45 and 50, and then everyone between 50 and 65. And so it doesn't tell you anything about that sort of, you know, between 50 and 55, between 55 and 60. It lumped everyone between 50 and 65 into the same group.
Thank you for that clarification.
Which, as Professor Clark has said, is not the norm.
Thank you.
The normal way to do it.
And if you were a peer review journal, certainly that would be cause for a rejection or at least major revision of the work before resubmitting for publication.
Thank you.
Good. Should we have the next slide then? Next slide.
Please,
okay.
So this was basically showing a report that the UK did, showing that the noise level or sensitivity had increased, and this was actually highlighted by Marshall Day as one of the reasons to say that people had gotten more sensitive to noise. However, you know, in doing these studies, you have to be very careful about whether you do a postal study or you do a postal study plus a call study, because you have the responses tend to differ based on those. And so one of the things that you look at, and you've seen in my evidence, is that when you make a correction for the fact that postal studies and postal plus calling call studies, I mean, studies where people call people and survey them, you actually see that there's no actual difference in what has happened in terms of people's sensitivity to noise. Next slide,
Thank
please.
you. And just relating to that, the Taylor-Bain study, Professor Clark, was that was a telephone study, was it, or a postal study?
I don't recall right top of my head at this
moment. We've got that in the evidence, but it was that's the reason why you thought it was perhaps not relatable to other studies, or one of the reasons. Right, next slide. Oh, well, we've already covered this one, haven't we?
We already covered this, so we can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
I think we should probably skip this, unless you, I mean, I think that, you know, complaints per household, and you can see here, can actually vary across sound levels. And so it's not a monotonic increasing, it's pretty flat up to about 55. And then you can see then it rapidly increases above 55, which is all the more reason. You know, 10.13 and 9.36 statistically for the Collette study is not, there's no difference between them. And so you see that the rise in complaints occur after 55, which is all the more supporting, well, at my point of view and many other people around the world's point of view, that 55 should be the right level.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. Okay, so the noise modeling assumption, yes. I think they have projected slower growth overall. And so they're saying that the airport will reach its practical maximum capacity in 2084, which is 60 plus years from now. And that capacity of 200,000 flights per year, in my experience, and this might sound, is not a realistic one. It's actually it's possible, but given the way traffic is worked, air traffic control is worked in Christchurch, I don't think is achievable. Also, I just don't think it's going to be that rapid growth of traffic just based on geography and the travel times, etc. But whether or not that 200,000 is there, and that is not the most, in my view, egregious thing in the noise modeling. I think the thing that bothers me most is that they have basically assumed that the aircraft will remain the same in terms of their noise levels as they are today, which in the next 60 years, we all know that Airbus and Boeing will be bringing in a new single-aisle aircraft between 2035 and 2045, because the current A320 fleet, I mean, and fuselage and body type and the 737 are really long in the tooth, and they're actively pursuing and developing new aircraft. So much so that I actually co-founded a company to develop hydrogen technology to push for that aircraft to be at hydrogen airplanes. That's how much I believed in that. And so you have new aircraft that will be coming into service in between 2035 and 2045. So by 2084, right, the fleet would have been swapped out to a new fleet of aircraft. And so by that time, the aircraft will be quieter than today. And so I've actually gone back and looked in history. I looked deliberately at the sideline noise, because there are 3 different noise levels that aircraft typically have: the landing noise, the takeoff noise, and the sideline noise. Sideline noise is the hardest to reduce. And it also has been shown from work at London Heathrow and other areas to be the best predictor of what the noise level will be in operations for an aircraft. And the sideline noise in the last 60 years has decreased by over 30 decibels. And the idea that in the next 60 years, aircraft will still be the same is absolutely preposterous. And I actually I've spoken to folks at Airbus and Boeing, and they have targets of noise reduction that are well above 5 decibels. But I said even 5 decibels is a conservative estimate, is the right number. And the other thing When you combine that noise level, which is today's aircraft without any reductions, and then you assume that the actual operations are going to be over 200,000 flights per year, right? And then you add to that that you take the worst 3 months of the year as a metric, as a measure by which you're going to put the contours. You have basically made it all the worst case assumptions. And if you do that in acoustics, you're going to end up with contours that are well in excess of what they will be in reality. And so those are my big issues with the modeling assumptions. And therefore, I think that they need to actually go back and so take a hard look. So what will happen is that the traffic will start to rise. And of course, if the traffic starts to rise with the current technology, the noise will go up. But then as new technology rolls in, then the noise at the source will go down, but the traffic will still rise, but the contours won't continue rising. And there are established metrics. You can look at ICAO for their retirement forecasts, which are globally accepted, about how aircraft are going to be turned over the next 40, 50, 60 years, which have been proven pretty accurate because it's a consensus built by manufacturers and airlines at ICAO. And so there are actual benchmarks and data for us to make sure do a better job of the modeling.
Thank you. Can I take you back, Professor Clark, to the, you referred to sideline noise. We heard from a planner for the airport yesterday. She's not an acoustic expert, but she spoke for the airport, and she talked about the noise created by air moving over the side of an aircraft as opposed to the engine noise. Is that what you mean by sideline noise?
No, that's not what I mean by sideline noise.
Is that different? Okay.
So apologies, I didn't intend to give a lecture on acoustics. My
we could all use one.
Yeah. So when you certify an airplane, you make 3 measurements. The first measurement is directly under the arrival path, and it's about I can't remember the actual distance, but it's directly under the sideline noise. I mean, right under the landing path, and that's called a landing noise. The aircraft is in its final approach configuration with the flaps extended, etc. And that is to give you an indicator of the noise you're going to hear when you're actually on approach, if you're directly below the aircraft. The second one is the takeoff or flyover noise point, and that is about 3,000 plus feet beyond the end of the airport, the end of the runway. And that one, you're allowed to take off at maximum thrust and then cut back to the minimum possible thrust and actually sneak, I like to call it, over the microphone. And so I think you can think of that that's the most the aircraft could be quiet if they actually did everything they can to minimize the noise at that point. In fact, when I did some work at Boeing, that was part of the analysis that we did when we certified an airplane to figure out exactly when to cut back the thrust and how much to cut it back so that the noise over that microphone at that distance, takeoff distance, the flyover point was minimized. The other one is sideline noise, which is basically off to the side of the runway. It's 1,000 feet to the side of the runway. And that noise is at full thrust. And that's basically, you take a flight down the runway, take off, and they have like a line that's 1,000 feet in parallel. And whatever the maximum noise along that line is called the sideline noise. And so while airplanes might say, I have this great flyover noise number, the thing that has proven to be the most accurate predictor of what the noise is going to be in daily operation is for takeoff is the sideline noise, not the flyover. And so that's the reason why I use that deliberately here, because I want it to be conservative and not to basically try to say that aircraft are going to be hugely quieter. I deliberately chose that one. Now, the noise that the planner was speaking about is what's called airframe noise. And that's the noise that's caused as the fuselage goes through the air. It basically, because of the friction on the side, creates eddies along the side of the aircraft, and that's called airframe noise. There's obviously the noise from the jets, there's noise from the flaps, there's noise from the landing gear. It turns out on landing, as we've gotten quieter and quieter engines at idle, because the aircraft is mostly idle, that the airframe noise and the engine noise have become comparable. And as engine noise, flap noise, and that's the reason sometimes you can hear the whining of the the bleed valves on the engines, because everything else is so quiet, because the engine by itself without the bleed valve working is pretty quieter on landing. On takeoff, engine noise still dominates and will dominate for a long time, just by the mere fact that you're going at a slower speed during takeoff as it's accelerating, and you're not going as you haven't slowed down. I mean, as you're coming in for landing, you're going from low to high speed as opposed to high to slow speed. So overall, your speed is slower. And then the other thing is that you need that engine thrust to get up, and that engine thrust comes with the noise. And so while the engines will get quieter, they're not going to get, like in the landing case where it's comparable to airframe noise, it's still going to be dominated by engine noise on takeoff. Is that okay, Lecter? Sorry.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Yeah. Good. I think that's everything that we looked at. So if you wouldn't mind just answering any questions from our panel, that would be great.
Happy to.
Yeah.
Panel, I'm sure Grant's got a question.
Yeah, thanks, John Paul. My question sort of goes back to this curiosity of why Christchurch has 50 decibels as some concern for some people. And I wondered, and you mentioned things like geography, climate change, in terms of the location of the Christchurch airport in a flat landscape surrounded by a predominantly rural environment with hardly any sort of background noise around it. Are those issues you talk about, could that sort of exacerbate in a slightly quieter environment the idea that it's worse than what it really is?
Well, it turns out that we already, my recollection of background noise in Christchurch, that it is, near the roads and stuff coming into the airport, et cetera, on that side of the airport, it's above the 55. So in fact, trying to get to 50 is you're going to be well below the ambient during the daytime. And we penalize in that LDN number, it's penalizing nighttime activity by 10 decibels already. And so it is already considering the actual ambient, the change from day to night in terms of more sensitivity at night. So I don't think that you need to add more and more. There's no reason to add more and more conservativity conservativity on top of all of that. Because the background noise, the ambient noise during the daytime in pretty much everywhere in the world, except in the Grand Canyon, is basically 55 or thereabouts or above.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have one question, John Paul. You mentioned an organisation. I think you mentioned the term ICAO.
Yes.
What does it
stand
for?
So ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. It's part of the UN. It predates the UN, actually, because it was from the Chicago Convention in 1944. The people that set the limits on how much money you get paid, reimbursed, and how much your family get if there's an accident or something like that. That was the ICAO, was basically looped under the UN. And so ICAO has a Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, CAPE, which meets formally to make recommendations every 3 years. And they have representatives, not every country in the UN. There's probably about 18 to 24, depending, who are members of CAPE. They have observers and supporting entities from the manufacturers, from the airlines, from NGOs. And I was the actual advisor to the US delegation for one cycle of CAPE. So I'm quite familiar with their workings. And so as part of their deliberation. So for example, going from stage 2 aircraft to stage 3, and those are just levels of stringency on aircraft noise. Those recommendations, which because it's a UN body, can't actually be requirements, but they're basically recommendations to countries, are based on assumptions that are debated rigorously between the NGOs and governments from different parts of the world and manufacturers about what will the fleet look like? How noisy will they be? What level is acceptable to everyone? And basically, and so as part of that process, they actually have formal processes for forecasting when aircraft are going to retire, when will the fleet change, to do exactly what I was saying, that you're going to have traffic growth, but you have to also consider the aircraft getting quieter and when they're going to get quieter, to actually understand how those contours are going to change, and also how much is it going to cost. So I will tell you, like, the stringent, we are now in stage 3 and we're going to stage 4, and those debates about whether to put more stringency were actually tempered by the fact that the aircraft were getting so much quieter, so much quicker, that they didn't need to add too much stringency going from stage 3 to stage 4.
Thank you, John Paul. It was a very long answer to my question about what ICAO stood for, but appreciate that.
Sorry.
Anyway. That's useful. Look, I think we're finished with you. I'd like to say a big thank you to Margot and a wonderful secretariat for making sure we could come back and hear from John Paul, given the problems we had yesterday. So thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you for your indulgence in giving us a second chance to connect up with John Paul, given our technical difficulties between here and Chile.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, that brings us to the end of our hearings today. We will adjourn the hearings, and we're starting tomorrow at 10 o'clock for a youth forum. So should be pretty interesting. A whole bunch of youth submitters from high schools and different places. So we're really looking forward to that as a panel. So I'll adjourn the hearing for today. Have a very safe weekend. Enjoy the weekend. And we'll see the panel and the team back on tomorrow. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Clark, again.
You're welcome.
Oh, Karakia, sorry. It's not on the, we will close with a lovely Karakia as we normally do. Thank you. Right. Thank you for reminding me.